それではお時間になりましたので、B4Ukraine Human Rights Now 共催 B4Ukraine キャンペーンイベント、ウクライナに対する侵略戦争に加担しないために、今日本企業がすべきこと、今私たちが日本企業や日本政府に対して求めるべきこと、特別ウェビナーを開始させていただきます。本日は多くの皆様にご参加をいただき、誠にありがとうございます。私は本日の司会進行を務めさせていただきます、Human Rights Now の川崎と申します。開会に先立ちまして、皆さんにお願い事項がございます。皆さんお待ちください。失礼します。このまますみません、続けさせていただきます。本イベントでは同時通訳をご利用いただけます。回線、機器の状況によっては通信が不安定になる可能性がございます。あらかじめご了承ください。録音ください。次オートセッションへのご質問は、チャットではなく、画面下の Q&A で随時受け付けています。ただし、時間の都合上、すべてのご質問にはお答えできないことがありますので、ご了承ください。イベントの進行を妨害される恐れがある、または本イベント、登壇者、主催者の心情を傷つけたり、誹謗中傷する恐れがあると主催者が判断した場合、途中で退席いただく可能性があります。こちらが本日の流れになります。まず、ウクライナの現状解説。その次に、海外企業と日本企業の対応と背景をご紹介し、その後、動員令をはじめとした日本企業のロシア経済、ロシア軍への影響をご説明いたします。事業撤退に関わる代表的な質問に対する回答の後、最後に会場との質疑応答、閉会挨拶とさせていただきます。それでは、ウェビナーを開始いたします。各登壇者へご質問がありましたら、画面下の Q&A ボックスにご記入をお願いいたします。なお、時間の都合上、すべてのご質問にはお答えが難しい場合がございます。あらかじめご了承をお願いいたします。まずはじめに B4Ukraine の運営委員会のメンバーであり、市民活動家、国際コミュニケーションの専門家、起業家として活躍されているナターレさんにウクライナの現状を解説していただきます。ナターレさん。
Kana-san, happy to be.
You can. Yes.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for your kind invitation to participate in this esteemed seminar. I will start sharing the screen and would love to share with you a brief update on where Ukraine stands in regards to maybe some of the reflections by Japanese companies in regards to their decisions on doing business in Russia and how it affects Ukraine. As a Ukrainian member of the steering committee of B4Ukraine, a coalition of civil society organizations and think tanks and experts united by one purpose to help businesses get on the right side of history and exit Russia, I have to say that, for Ukraine, the war started not on 24th of February in 2022, but over 9 years ago. But it is starting this date last year that all of Ukraine and every Ukrainian has felt what it means to live during the full-scale invasion after Russia has amassed a great number of troops on our borders and has launched the biggest attack on a European state ever since the World War II. Every single Ukrainian city ever since has endured these sounds: children, women, the elderly people who have to hear them very often, sometimes every second day. Ever since February 24th of this 9-year war that Russia launched on Ukraine, and especially this last year, almost a year, 11 months of full-scale invasion, many lives have been lost in Ukraine. And the statistics that we can share with you, that you can see in open sources, of course, they're much lower than the actual statistics, because the civilian deaths and including children, they're calculated excluding territories like Mariupol or Volnovakha and others that are occupied. There are verified numbers of missiles and kamikaze drones that are launched across Ukraine. There are right now already over 65,000 Russian war crimes committed against Ukraine. There is a price to those Russian attacks. And I can tell you that the price that Russia spent on, let's say, a missile attack, including 84 cruise missiles and 24 kamikaze drones on 10th of October, when one of my colleagues in my company has come back to Ukraine with her little daughter to her own apartment in Kyiv just to witness that kind of attack. It cost $700 million. Or the attack in December when I went to visit my team and my family in Ukraine cost Russia $500 million for the number of missiles that were going into Kyiv as I was there. Russia is spending great number of funds on all of these troops and vehicles and fuel tanks and artillery and MLRSs and special equipment and aircraft warfare that protects them against us being able to defend ourselves. And at the same time, every single day, those missiles do hit buildings, do kill people in Ukraine, do deprive Ukrainians of the normality of any life. And they have already cost at least 138 billion in damage to Ukraine's infrastructure. This is how Ukraine looked in space when Russia also decided in the fall to freeze Ukrainians and to kind of plunge Ukraine into darkness. I think it contrasts very much the life in any civilized country. And unfortunately, we cannot really calculate, right, the suffering of the people, because can it really ever be calculated that in the 21st century, there is a country that can disregard completely the value of human life, any human right whatsoever, and plunge millions of people so that they will have to spend most of their time in shelters, like in Kyiv subways, or being evacuated from the cities where they've lived happily, or that we would see constantly strollers in the destroyed cities of Ukraine, or there would be kids on the ruins of their buildings, or that we would find the graves of the Ukrainians that were tortured before they would be killed in some of the Ukrainian cities that are being liberated. Is this war too distant? I don't think so, because I think even for Japan, this war comes close to heart, not only because of the level of sympathy to Ukraine and sharing the understanding of the value of human life, but also because Japanese journalists have been wounded in the streets of Kyiv. Japanese volunteers have died in defending Ukraine, and Japanese people have protested against this Russian aggression against Ukraine. This incalculable suffering of Ukrainians, this damage to Ukraine and the Russian war machine are sponsored by taxes of international companies that are continuing to do business in Russia. And unfortunately, Japan is in the fourth place of amongst quite a few number of countries whose large numbers of businesses are still continuing to do operations in Russia, regardless of these 11 months of war. USA, Germany, and Great Britain are in the top 3, but Japan is number 4. Japanese companies in Russia, my colleague Andrei Onoprienko will tell you great more statistics, but they still are getting earnings in billions of dollars, employing over 38,000 of people. 163 companies are remaining, and meager 4 have completed their exits from Russia. They represent very different sectors, majority in manufacturing, but also some in construction, architecture, and industrial equipment, in IT. And in the course of the seminar, we will share with you more information about the types of excuses that we hear from the companies when we speak with them, the types of rationale that they somehow rationalize when discussing their continued operations in Russia, or their plans, or the obstacles they're facing. So we'd like to share with you what we hear, and also give you kind of our assessment of what we think about it, and en masse, what are our conclusions from it. So I would stop here and pass the floor to my colleague Andrei Onoprienko from KC Institute, on whose data we at B4Ukraine rely in our work and in our engagement with businesses. Andrei.
Thank you, Natalia. Thanks everyone for joining this event, and thanks for the possibility to present what we identified so far. And I will share my slides. As you can see, KC Institute, which I'm proud to be part of, as well as B4Ukraine Coalition, we launched since the beginning of war, Leave Russia project, and analyze the situation on Russian market on daily basis. We have the database currently with more than 3,000 companies identified from 87 countries. We established a dedicated Telegram bot, which is give opportunity to identify news on those companies on a daily basis. We have Twitter account and present weekly digests, already issued almost 40 of them. And our main sources like website livrussia.org. You can visit it and see all the required details there. Continuing to what Natalia said, how many companies in general, yes, are still pull out or in process of pulling out from Russia. We identified more than 1,300 of such companies. At the same time, the significant portion, much more, around 1,700 companies are still remaining. Those companies received more than 164 billion revenue in 2021, and they employed almost 600,000 people. And in taxes, they paid more than 17 billion taxes, which we were able to identify. Of course, there are some indirect taxes which they pay as VAT, for example. And what also interesting, economic indicators, but also country of origin is particular, whether they impose sanctions or not, also make a very significant influence on companies' decisions, stay or leave. And we identified if country which represent company has office has imposed sanctions against Russia, there is a probability that companies will leave 4 times higher than those who are not refrained from sanctions. In this table, you can see the recent statistics. Unfortunately, it was a bit updated about a week ago, but we have the latest one available in our latest weekly digest, and the situation is not changed dramatically. As of now, we identified 179 already companies which completely exited from Russia. That means that those companies has fully sold their business or they liquidated entities in Russia. Those companies had quite significant number of staff, more than 300,000, and they generated a year ago more than 42 billion of annual revenue, and had very significant portion of capital and assets. Those companies who declared complete withdrawal had still another almost 170,000 of staff. They also received about 34 billion in revenues. And those who are like suspended operations, they as well, you can see the detailed statistics. But the most critical is the lower part, those companies who are waiting or post their investments. But we understand that in this case, it's not totally true because they still continue to receive profit in Russia and they reinvest that profit as like reinvestment. So in fact, they are lying not only to themselves, but to the whole like society and world. As Natalia presented, here is the breakdown for top 20 countries. And as it was said that USA, Germany, and Great Britain are in top 3. Unfortunately, Japan as well in top 5. It's on the 4th place and have at least what we identified 165 companies. And the significant portion of those companies are still waiting, more half staying and 16% are waiting. At the same time, 32% announced that they will withdraw the country, and another 4% are like already left. Here is an industry breakdown, which you could see, and also top industries. And sector by sector, you can see who has which status. And of course, what is like pity is that those sectors which are more like perspective from revenue generated like energy, oil and gas, there is still significant portion of companies staying or waiting. And pharma even more, the biggest portion is not withdrawn from country, or for example, metals and mining. So those are the sectors which are like very strong in Russia, and unfortunately, a lot of companies are continuing to like earn money in Russian like energy-driven economy. Here you can see a list of foreign banks. It was presented by Financial Times a few weeks ago. They identified about 40 banks, foreign banks, which like stuck in Russia, and show the assets which they had at the beginning of 2000. Unfortunately, there are most of those banks are Japanese one, 7, and they also in top 5 in terms of assets presence. Those are Sumitomo Mitsui, Russian bank, part of Sumitomo Mitsui Financial Group, or Mitsubishi Financial Group, Mitsuho Financial Group, Toyota Motor Corporation, Mitsubishi Corporation, SBI Holdings, HS Holding. And you can see more details in the assets in billion rubles. What is also probably worth to mention that what we see is that in general, development of Russian-Japanese economic relations is hindered by the crisis situation in Russia. We know that there is a long story and long time conflict on territorial, let's say, issue on Kuril Islands, which is still under like considerations. At the same time, we are glad that Japan, as well as USA and EU, joined and introduced a lot of sanctions along with other countries. But unfortunately, oil and gas still fuels Russian war in Ukraine. More than a third of Russia's state revenue comes from these sales. For example, according to Ministry of Finance of Japan, Japanese export to Russia in July last year increased significantly compared to previous year. Already in August, in connection to increase of global energy prices, Japan trade increased by 31%. And it's mainly liquid natural gas, and it increased more than 200% compared to August last year. And we can say that further development of Japanese Russian economic relations and hindered by geopolitical crisis in Europe, which leads to the lack of serious economic interest of Japan in Russia. And also, as it will be presented probably later, that in terms of like dispute over Kuril Island, and that there is still like no signing of peace treaty between countries following World War II. This territorial issue will exist, and Russia will put additional pressure on it. And at the same time, we understand that Japan also depends on energy oil sector, and we see continuous trend of, as I presented above, of increasing trade volumes. And also, what is important to mention that last week, for example, we identified and changed statuses for 3 insurance companies from Japan, which continue to provide the insurance to Russian ships, even though that they promised to stop it before, and also they increased at the same time almost twice price for the insurance. And if to analyze in more details Japanese companies, what I presented before, you can see as well statistics, and Natalia partly presented, out of 164 companies, only 4 fully exited. And at the same time, the most significant portion is still, you can see that 51 we identified as leaving or at least promised to leave, and 83 and 26 are waiting, with quite significant number of staff still employed and revenue received in the country. And here is also a breakdown exactly on Japanese companies and they share in revenue. They like revenue in Russia versus global. And we see that some sectors, at least 4 industries are, even more of them, but 4 are very dependent. They have more than 3% of revenue generated in Russia. Is IT, industrial equipment, construction, and manufacturing. Also, probably worth to mention that at the beginning of war, Russian government included Japan in official list of countries and regions and labeled them as unfriendly. And that means that according to the latest law of Russia, those companies are not able to vote, and their shares will not be taken into account when there are meetings of shareholders, and the law allows Russian part not to take into account like votes and shares of such foreigners which were labeled as unfriendly. And probably the last slide is that's a like summary and some logos of companies with different statuses. More details you can see with the link on our website, and just put filter Japan, and you will see that which companies are like staying, waiting, leaving, or exited. And I would like to say separate thank you to Nissan, Logisnext, Furuna, and Entity Data for making the final decision to like leave. And I would also, what has changed, I need to stress that, for example, Toyota, we saw that they returned to the market, and they started to supply parts for cars, even though they closed their plant before, and they stopped and lay off employees. Okay, thank you for attention. If there will be questions, I will answer them later. And I would like to provide the word to my colleague, Richard.
ありがとうございます。海外企業と日本企業の対応と背景になりました。次に B4Ukraine の運営委員会のメンバーであり、ハートランドイニシアティブのエグゼクティブディレクター兼共同設立者のリチャードさんに動員令をはじめとした日本企業の日本企業のロシア経済 ロシア軍への影響についてご報告いただきます。リチャードさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Good morning, everyone. First off, thanks to Kana and Human Rights Now for pulling together this timely conversation. It's a pleasure to be joined by my good friends and colleagues from the B4Ukraine coalition. Natalia and Andrei exemplify the best of Ukraine and its long struggle for democracy and dignity in the face of centuries of aggression. And a special thanks to Andrei for comprehensively laying out the statements, decisions, and actions of international companies generally, and Japanese companies specifically in response to Russia's war in Ukraine. It's said that where we stand on the issues depends on where we sit. So please allow me to offer a few words about my organization and our approach before I dig into the question at hand. Heartland Initiatives is an American practice-based research organization. Our primary mission is to assist investors in identifying, assessing, and addressing human rights risks in their portfolios, specifically those associated with business activities in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. They can include international armed conflicts, internal armed conflicts, military occupations, and particularly high-risk contexts like Xinjiang region of China and the southern border of the United States. We operate on the premise that it's in these areas where salient human rights risks most often translate to financially material risks in terms of legal liability, regulatory enforcement, operational disruptions, and reputational damage. Nowhere is that more true today than in Russia, thanks in no small part to the recent partial mobilization decree. As Andrei noted, in response to the February 2022 invasion, more than 600 international companies have publicly pledged to exit the Russian market. Yet nearly 1,700 international companies, including 109 Japanese companies, continue their operations in Russia, attempting to balance their continuing business activities with an expanding universe of legal, operational, and financial risks. In July of last year, Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a new law allowing the government to impose special economic measures to support, and this is a quote, counterterrorism and other operations outside of Russia. According to this law, should the Russian government decide to do so, it may force any company to enter into a contract to provide goods and services for Russian military engagements abroad. Moreover, Putin's declaration of martial law and the establishment of a coordination council in occupied Ukrainian regions could mean, and again, this is a quote, streamlining the federal and private sector resources towards the war efforts in Ukraine. The legal risks facing companies operating in Russia increased significantly in September 2022, when President Putin announced a series of amendments to a longstanding federal law on mobilization, training, and mobilization in the Russian Federation. This is what has become known as the partial mobilization decree or order. And while the decree was widely discussed simply in terms of increased troop levels, it marks a new red line for potential corporate complicity in violations of international law and material risks for companies and their shareholders. Along with Putin's other legislative measures, the Russian military's commission of more than 65,000 war crimes, and the international community's response, the decree has undoubtedly made Russia one of the world's most hostile markets for multinational companies. The mobilization decree creates obligations for Russian citizens and Russia-based organizations, including the nearly 1,700 international companies operating in Russia. The law establishes the forced conscription of Russian citizens eligible to serve in the military and requires Russian-based companies to facilitate conscription through military registration of and delivery of summons to eligible staff. In addition, the law mandates that all organizations comply with government orders to provide information, equipment, buildings, communications, land plots, transport, and other types of material support to the war effort. These are not insignificant forms of support to a state conducting an illegal war of aggression against its democratic neighbor. Companies are prohibited from refusing mobilization orders or terminating government contracts to avoid carrying out conscription or resource-related tasks. Violations of these orders can result in civil fines, criminal penalties against company executives, including a prison term of up to 8 years, and forced performance of contractual obligations via judicial mechanisms. The impacts of the decree on companies are just beginning to be felt. In October, a Russian IT specialist at Raiffeisen Bank was killed 3 weeks after being conscripted under the partial mobilization decree, despite the company seeking an exemption. Other companies are neither seeking exemptions nor assisting employees. For example, it was reported in October that the American oilfield service firm Schlumberger was facing employee backlash in Russia over the company's military draft cooperation. More than 9,000 Russian employees began receiving military draft notices through work, and the company was not authorizing remote employment to escape mobilization. Active or passive compliance with conscription orders endangers employees and casts doubts on corporate claims that they maintain operations in Russia for the benefit of their employees. It also shows the tension between obeying domestic law and abiding by international law and evolving business and human rights norms. While Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced on October 27th that the mobilization to send reinforcements to fight in Ukraine was complete, no presidential decree to officially end the mobilization has been issued. In fact, over the last 2 weeks, new reports have surfaced that the Ministry of Defense needs to recruit about 700,000 more Russian citizens for the war by February. Therefore, all companies in Russia remain at acute risk of their employees being conscripted and mobilized as the war continues. In the event the decree is rescinded, the Russian government will still have grounds to oblige businesses to provide services and goods for its military efforts. Thank you.
キャードさん、ありがとうございます。続きまして、企業撤退に関わる代表的な質問について、スピーカーの皆さんに伺ってみたいと思います。まず、代表的な質問1つ目。ロシアで事業を継続する企業はどのような主張をしていますか？また、その主張に対する B4Ukraine の見解を教えてください。ナターレさん、こちらご回答いただけるでしょうか？
Thank you, Kana, for this question. Let me again just share the screen. Yeah. So essentially, we have heard. We have engaged with many companies who continue to do business in Russia, regardless of these regulatory, financial, reputational, and other risks that my colleagues have mentioned, and especially Richard, who outlined these risks related to the mobilization decree. Companies from Japan also have articulated their reasons to wait on the decision or to stay. As you can see, for example, some like Komatsu are waiting still for future development on the Ukrainian situation, even though for Ukrainians and their sufferings, it's pretty clear. Toshiba also has decided to wait and not to exit the Russian market, even though, as it's typical to many other corporations, their revenues in Russia account only for 0.2% of overall revenues. And we're confident that that level of revenues can probably be replaced by operating in other more rule-obeying markets. There was one executive at a Japanese firm who declined to be named, but he commented that they just don't want to leave because they have great employees in Russia who has worked with them for decades. So it's a matter of loyalty, but that loyalty again puts a question of the price currently paid by Ukrainians with their human lives. Others genuinely feel that their blocking of services may lead to harm the people of Ukraine by preventing secure communications. But I think we need to look more in depth into the role Japanese companies are playing in some of the communications that also do lead to the increased war effort in Ukraine. Companies like Suzuki say that we wish for the situation to be brought to an end as soon as possible. There would be peace for all. From our perspective, we have to fight for that peace. We have to ensure the preconditions for that peace. That peace is not going to appear on its own, and there is a very important role that businesses can play. All of the different excuses we have heard from talking not only to Japanese companies but others, we've kind of grouped into 7 excuses that one of them is we are a big employer. We have duty to protect and provide the security to Russian employees. Rich has mentioned already how Raiffeisen Bank was not able to save its employee who was enlisted in the Russian army, was conscripted according to that mobilization law and killed in Ukraine. We've also heard excuses such as we are providing aid to Ukraine, we're investing in Ukraine's reconstruction, and therefore find it okay to continue operating in the Russian market. Well, from our perspective, we kind of call it blue-yellow washing, because no amount of investment in Ukraine right now can compensate again for the level of human rights abuses, war crimes, and suffering of the Ukrainian nation undergoing exactly right now, as companies such as Rockwool, for example, it's a Danish company, is insulating the Russian homes and making them warmer, while Ukrainians in many parts of Ukraine have been freezing in the cold months of water. And these investments are not in any way commensurate of what they have planned to do for the reconstruction of Ukraine versus the earnings and their contributions to the Russian budget that does allow them to buy those missiles, drones, and other things. Also, we are sometimes shocked to the extent to which companies are not willing to address future scenarios. Like in some of the conversations we're hearing, well, we don't see utility of speculating of how we might react to potentially endless array of future scenarios. The reality is that we all know now that after having committed 65,000 war crimes, Russia is going to be prosecuted for them, is going to be recognized as a villain in this war, and all of those companies that continue operating are basically enabling it to continue to do that, and that has a backlash in terms of reputation against, like people, not only Ukrainian diaspora, but others who are protesting against these companies, and that will continue to go on. So these things are not commensurate in terms of providing aid to Ukraine and investing in Ukraine's reconstruction, but at the same time signing the contracts with Russian Defense Ministry or having existing procurement agreements with the Russian government. Some companies do not want to forego their IP and assets in Russia, but again, I think it needs to be very, very clear for all multinationals that Russian state has made sure that no one can really protect their IP in Russia. Russia has resorted to holding passengers hostage in case they need it in global sanctions evasion. And it disregards all of the IP, even on things like cartoons. So on more valuable IP, definitely it can ensure that if it wants to nationalize it, if it wants to use it for the purposes of the military and the Russian war economy, it would. There is this notion that others are not leaving, and we're kind of waiting for the rest of the sector or the rest of our industry to leave. There are, of course, examples where in the beer industry, for example, there were first companies who made the steps, including Carlsberg and Tuborg and others, and then the others have followed. So our approach here is that those companies who want to leave should not be waiting like Total for a case to be brought against them in court, but need to make that leadership decision and exit before. Some have said that, Second World War ended and business thrived, and we need to defend our market share in a market that will grow eventually. Well, I think we need to be, again, look more attentively into history, because yes, the outcomes of Second World War have, of course, reverberated all throughout the world. But in case of Germany, and not only Germany, of course, there's been a long road to the potential recovery that has also gone through a series of sufferings and reparations and denazification and a creation of rule of law and other important frameworks that created this scene in which the the multinationals were able to earn in the last year. So before that happens, Russia is not going to be an attractive and rules-based market in which to operate. For companies, Russia is not such a huge market to replace. Really, for majority, it's under 1%. For many, it's between 1 and 10% or a little more. So that revenue can be replaced and in other markets, and there are already cases of that. And I think companies need to understand also the Russians are already doing it, substituting the international brands with the local ones without any disregard, again, for the trademarks or the logos or the visual identity. In the Russian market right now, there is no legal obligation to do anything. There is one more excuse that is very typical and well used. It's called providing essential goods to the Russian people. That's why I think B4Ukraine, and maybe Rich will talk a little bit more about it, have developed like a checklist according to which all companies can answer a list of questions to see whether what they're providing really meets the criteria of what essential food would be. Because unfortunately, it's basically a kind of a trap in which companies are saying that things like cereals or biscuits or chocolates or chewing gum can be essentials. Of course, they're not, and it's just a way to protect market share and continue to act unethically. And many of these items, have a very strong chance of ending up in the military packages of the Russian army, and again, increase that level of complicity and increase the level of enabling of the Russian war effort. Another point that we heard is that the management has fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder value. But again, we feel that in that regard, the only fiduciary responsibility of all companies or management of the companies leading their operations in Russia is actually to work for the shareholders and to defend them against all of these regulatory, reputational, financial risks that Rich has already described. We perceive Russia's attack on Ukraine as an attack on rules-based order on which the global economy and international community depend. A phrase from one of our colleagues on the steering committee, Bennett Freeman, and it truly is so. Russia is undermining the very rules and frameworks that have allowed companies to build trust. And of course, the price that companies are paying for staying in Russia are right now already in their reputation, because contemporary customers, contemporary young customers, contemporary people and citizens in different democracies and countries in the world, they do lose trust in people who, in entities that continue to do business in country like Russia. They're altering their understanding of the brand, and they do want the brands to punish Russia, not just comply with sanctions, but also go beyond and show leadership, seeing the war like that. Ukrainian economy has been suffering greatly and will continue to suffer greatly. But we believe that it is very important for all companies and Japanese companies who, as we've mentioned, are in place number 4 in contributing to the Russian war economy, to take on a wider role in this new geopolitical corporate responsibility if we want rules-based order to be restored. And to then, get the dividends from that geopolitical responsibility, because there are companies that we monitor, like Societe Generale, who's exited the Russian market, and they took a loss. They wrote off the losses, like some companies are doing right now, after Russia has increased obstacles to leave and exit the Russian market. But they're doing just fine. They managed to outperform their rivals, and the same has happened with Lego, and the same has happened with Equinor. And we are hearing of more examples of companies who made the right decision, and actually their business has not suffered, but moreover, the loyalty of their employees and the loyalty of their customers has grown. So our call, again, to all of the business, including Japanese companies, is to reconsider their presence in Russia, and hopefully there will be more than only 4 Japanese companies who will have exited completely. I'll stop here and be happy to answer any additional questions it may be.
ナタールさん、ありがとうございます。続いて2つ目の質問に移りたいと思います。 2つ目の質問はこちらになります。撤退後、企業の収益にはどのような変化がありますか？また、ロシアでの事業継続のリスクについて教えてください。こちら、アンドリーさん、リチャードさん、お願いしてよろしいでしょうか。
Thank you. I will share. We did. Just a second. I will share the screen again. Is it visible? We made some time ago analysis. We check groups of companies, those who are public ones and listed on stock markets over the world, how change of revenue of their mother companies has changed basically year to year or quarter to quarter. In this dashboard and our analysis performed before, you could see that those companies who announced that they are leaving, they increased their revenue quarter to quarter, quarter Q3 to this year to Q3 previous year, more than 25%. Those who exited almost for 21%. At the same time, those who are staying or waiting, figures and revenue increase significantly lower, just about 15-16%. So the conclusion could be that those companies who made decision and exited, or at least announced that they will exit from country, they were able to generate higher revenues and compensate losses which they occurred with exiting the country. As for the second part of the question, I will probably give a word to my colleague, Richard, about the risks.
I'm going to take a step back and provide a general overview of the expanding universe of material risks for international companies operating in Russia. In September, as Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilians and critical infrastructure escalated, and President Putin announced the illegal annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, the international community responded with sanctions targeting key components in Russian weapon systems and shell companies that have assisted in sanctions evasion. These actions build upon already unprecedented array of economic sanctions, export controls, and import regimes imposed by numerous governments. Taken collectively, they've created an environment of such severe regulatory risk that many companies have terminated contracts, limited operations, and/or withdrawn from the market entirely with significant losses. Companies continuing operations and/or relationships in Russia face compounding legal risks. A company may be complicit in and its executives prosecuted for a war crime under Article 25 of the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute, as long as it had knowledge of the act, even if it did not intend for it to be carried out. In light of the partial mobilization order, companies should be aware that their personnel and material resources could be used to support the invasion of Ukraine and associated war crimes. Similarly, companies found that facilitated or participated in violations of international law in conflict can now be found criminally liable under growing national legal regimes. This trend in precedent is best demonstrated by the criminal cases against Lafarge for its conduct in Syria and Lundin for its operations in Sudan. French prosecutors have already investigated Total Energies for its connection to Russia's invasion after French and Ukrainian NGOs filed a complaint under French law, accusing the oil company of supplying jet fuel for the Russian warplanes carrying out military attacks against civilians in Ukraine, including the bombing of a theater in Mariupol that killed 600 Ukrainians. Though prosecutors ultimately determined that there wasn't sufficient evidence to proceed, the case illustrates how the legal theories that have penalized Lafarge and Lundin hundreds of millions of dollars can be applied to companies that are providing material support to the Russian military as it commits war crimes and crimes against humanity. Furthermore, the partial mobilization decree may provide the evidence necessary to bring these types of claims and assist in meeting required knowledge standards, as companies will undoubtedly know their resources are being used to further Russia's war effort. Liability is further heightened by the growing number of jurisdictions mandating companies undertake human rights and environmental due diligence, from the French duty of vigilance law and the adoption in 2021 of new laws in Germany and Norway, to the publication of a proposal for an EU-wide law in 2022. And let's not forget about Japan's recently published due diligence guidelines that aim to assist companies operating in Japan to identify and prevent human rights-related abuses in their global supply chains. The companies that remain also face direct and indirect operational and financial risks, including the potential expropriation and seizure of assets of companies from unfriendly countries, including Japan, loss of suppliers, partnerships, and customers due to supply chain disruptions, inability to retain skilled employees, reputational harm, and difficulty delivering goods and services. For example, in July 2022, President Putin signed an order seizing control of the Sakhalin-2 gas and oil project, taking over all rights and obligations of the Sakhalin Energy Investment Company, and risking the interest of 2 Japanese companies. As I mentioned earlier, under the partial mobilization decree, companies could also lose access to employees or be forced to hand over buildings, production capacity, or transportation to the Russian state. Because of the ongoing legislative action taken by Russia, companies that remain in Russia must accept that they're crossing a new red line in corporate complicity and material risk. By requiring corporate support for the illegal invasion and occupation of Ukraine, Russia's mobilization decree makes it nearly impossible for companies to reconcile their obligations under international law, the UN guiding principles, and Western sanctions regimes with Russian law. Combined with the regulatory and legal risks arising from the international responses to the invasion, Russia now represents a business environment of human rights and material risks so severe that they cannot be responsibly managed by foreign companies, whatever their stated intentions. Thank you.
アンドリーさん、リチャードさん、ありがとうございます。続いて最後の質問に参りたいと思います。紛争などの影響を受ける地域での人権デューデリジェンスについて教えてください。こちら、もう一度になりますが、リチャードさん、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you, and I'm going to do my best to speak slowly and clearly. This is my longest section and one that requires a little bit of fleshing out. So let's start with the basics. The World Bank estimates that by 2030, two-thirds of the world's poor will live in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Companies operating in an atmosphere of pervasive violence, instability, and corruption face any number of threats, ranging from physical violence to supply chain disruptions to market divestment. As recent crises in Ukraine, Myanmar, Mozambique, and Xinjiang demonstrate, it is critically important for all stakeholders in conflict-affected areas to do their part in trying to prevent and mitigate the myriad risks associated with these events. And that means conducting heightened human rights due diligence. The international community has responded to the increasing number and intensity of global conflicts with a corresponding increase in targeted sanctions regimes, export and import controls, lawsuits against companies on behalf of impacted rights holders, and international advocacy campaigns. These responses have created an expanding universe of regulatory, legal, operational, and reputational risks for companies and their shareholders. Investors have likewise been mobilized into action, spurred by an evolving definition of fiduciary duty that considers risks to people as well as their portfolios. In 2020, the Responsible Investor Network, USCIF, found that conflict risk was the single largest ESG criteria among surveyed investors, representing over $6 trillion in assets under management. As an example, consider the public statements on the crises in Myanmar, Ukraine, and Xinjiang. Collectively, these 3 declarations were signed by hundreds of institutional investors with over $11 trillion assets under management, Having helped draft the statements on Myanmar and Ukraine, worked with investors on dozens of multinational company engagements on these and other conflict-affected areas, and having reviewed investors' portfolios for conflict-related risks, Heartland knows firsthand that these risks are becoming priorities for investors. With increased interest, but limited resources, investors are becoming more focused in their approach on heightened human rights due diligence. In other words, they're prioritizing certain components in this process during their company engagements, and this is where I'd like to focus. Unlike individual companies that conduct heightened due diligence for their direct and value chain operations, investors may have thousands of companies in their portfolios. This challenge means that investors are forced to focus on the most severe social and material risks in their portfolios, often and increasingly those related to conflict. Investors are unsatisfied with basic conversations about the UN guiding principles or static policies not tailored to the company's specific markets, products, and services. And investors are relying less and less on ESG research providers and ratings agencies for social risk assessments, given these institutions' well-documented deficiencies in assessing the impact of company behavior on people and communities. Heartland's methodology and work with investors seeks to simplify the approach to identifying conflict and human rights risks in investment portfolios, while deepening the analysis of these risks for people and financial performance. This work has led to what we hope are more sophisticated investor-led company engagements around a company's heightened human rights due diligence process. I'd like to offer a glimpse into that process now, since it's widely applicable to investors and civil society alike. First, where's the company operating? Investors are moving beyond siloed approaches to understanding local contexts, whether those are focused on geopolitics, corruption, or sanctions. Increasingly, investors expect companies to understand the nuances of human rights regimes under which they operate. They want to know how close operations are to the conflict and what specific risks the conflict represents to employees, local residents, and the company. What concrete steps are companies taking to regularly assess conflict dynamics, prevent and mitigate risk to employees, communities, and facilities, and contribute to peace-building efforts? Operating in Russia after the invasion and occupation of Crimea in 2014 should have been a red flag for all stakeholders, including companies and investors. Continuing to operate in Russia after the full-scale invasion and occupation of Ukraine in 2020 should be considered crossing a red line, representing the greatest possible threat to the rights of Ukrainians and the most severe ethical and material risk to companies and investors. Second, who is the company in business with? Investors are no longer satisfied with companies that just follow a sanctions compliance approach. This is particularly relevant when you think back to Natalia's comments about the preferred excuses of companies continuing operations in Russia. Sanctions compliance is not human rights compliance. Let me say that one more time. Sanctions compliance is not human rights compliance. For example, semiconductor companies whose dual-use components were found in Russian and Iranian weapon systems used against Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure have claimed they are sanctions compliant. However, this is of little comfort to Ukrainians and is of little relevance to the reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny these companies are now facing as a result of their inadequate due diligence. And since sanctions compliance is not human rights compliance, investors are increasingly asking the details of a customer's know your customer due diligence process. For example, do they utilize local, national, and international civil society reporting versus relying solely on government sanctions lists? If they decide to enter a high-risk area, are they putting into place contractual and operational human rights safeguards? As sanctions, lawsuits, operational disruptions, and other conflict-related risks continue to proliferate, resulting in human and financial costs, investors are asking for preventative versus reactive due diligence. The limitations of relying on sanctions compliance have been brought into stark relief by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. President Putin's territorial ambitions were telegraphed well ahead of the full-scale invasion. His rights-violating record and the contributions of now sanctioned state-owned and affiliated companies and business oligarchs had been well documented for years. This is the case in any number of conflict-affected areas. There are foreseeable risks to having authoritarians or their proxies in your value chain. Third, what are the specific risks to the company? Investors are evolving beyond just accepting references to the UN Guiding Principles and other human rights instruments. Anti-trafficking and diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, or compliance with certain stated policies on issues like conflict minerals. These are, of course, necessary building blocks in the development of a company's human rights policy, but they do not demonstrate the kind of operational commitment to the prevention and mitigation of human rights risks that investors want to see. Instead, they're asking if companies have evaluated the human rights risks of their specific business model, products, and services, perhaps through saliency mapping efforts, and that their policies and practices are tailored to address these risks. For example, have semiconductor companies evaluated the specific risks of how their products and services may be used in violation of international humanitarian and human rights law during the Russian invasion? And if they have, what safeguards have they put in place to prevent or mitigate, or at least reduce these risks? Has a company with a large Russian workforce and operational footprint, like Mondelez or Schlumberger, assessed how the partial mobilization order could require their employees to participate in an illegal invasion or acquire the operational resources to be used in support of the invasion? Failure to do so, especially in a market where all companies are being required to mobilize and provide support to the war effort, would represent a corresponding failure of the company's ethical and fiduciary duties to the workforce, local communities, and shareholders. Fourth and finally, how is the company remedying risks? Internal whistleblower policies and external hotlines are no longer considered sufficient. Again, while necessary, such an approach is focused almost entirely on internal employees and is rarely accessible to impacted rights holders close to company operations. Instead, investors are asking, does the company have a public access to remedy policy? And more importantly, how are stakeholders, including adversely impacted individuals, engaged during these processes? In the engagement process, is the engagement process ongoing and regular? Does the company manage expectations, and is stakeholder engagement acted upon? Is the process conducted in a way that ensures the security of stakeholders? And does the company publicly report on the outcomes of these processes? Once again, companies operating in or with Putin's Russia are uniquely challenged. How does a company realistically remedy risk related to the partial mobilization order? The options seem to be to avoid or ignore domestic Russian law and risk substantial penalties, or participate and risk violations of international law and normative frameworks like the UNGPs with the attendant material risks. In closing, I'd simply say now is not the time for business as usual in Russia. Now is the time to support our Ukrainian friends on the front lines, not to pad corporate bottom lines at their expense. Thank you.
木畑さん、ありがとうございました。それでは、ここからは登壇者の皆様に、申し訳ございません。それでは、ここからは参加者の皆様にお寄せいただいた質問にお答えいただきたいと思います。まずはじめに、匿名の参加者からのご質問です。企業が多くの撤退を表現している国はどこなのでしょうか。また、その国の企業が多く撤退している理由を教えていただけないでしょうか。アンドリーさん、リチャードさん、ナタールさん、アンドリーさんがすでにお答えいただいている内容ではありますが、もう一度ご説明いただけますか。
Kana-san, is my understanding correct that the question is about the companies being able to regain their market share in case they leave? I mean, if so, then I think we've made some examples, and Andriy has shared this data that the companies whose financial performance has been monitored by KSC and who have left, Actually their financial performance improved after they've left the Russian market. And also the concrete examples in our engagements with companies that have exited the Russian market, like Societe Generale that I have mentioned, or Lego company, or Equinor. There is also a company called FMC. They're a first fertilizers producer who have made the decision to leave the Russian market in the first week of war, or rather full-scale invasion last year, and have completed their exit in the first months. They all said that towards the closure of financial year, they did not lose from that decision. And they have repurposed, of course, and rethought other markets in which they would be making their investments and drawing on of their clients. And I think that already happens according to this process that Richard has so eloquently described, in which companies are reassessing all of their risks in regards to human rights abuses, and are ensuring that they working in the markets in which they can address those issues. Some of these companies are seriously thinking about their investments and input into the Ukrainian economy. And I can just say that as a Ukrainian, I would hope that there would be even preference for the companies, for the Ukrainian economy, who have made the right decision to leave the Russian market as soon as possible.
I can add on my side that in average, what we identified so far, about in average for all companies, their revenue share in Russian market is about 4.5%. That's very not significant part, and it could be easily compensated with other markets. Even though Russia is really big market and big country in terms of the overall, yeah. What is also worth to mention, those money for those companies who continue trading with Russia, that's really dirty money. They supply to the war machine, and they should understand that continuing to do so, they are considered anyhow as involved in that war, directly or indirectly. We identified few cases when some Japanese as well companies parts were found in drones which attack Ukrainian cities and villages. Companies in some cases provide answers, in some cases not, how those parts appeared. But for us as Ukrainians, we are not considering how those parts, and of course that's, as I said, will be dirty money to trade, and especially for those IT and technical equipments. We know that Japan, for example, and US are one of the best in terms of technological sector, and those parts are really critical for Russian economy. And once companies stop exporting those parts, there will be less drones, less rockets which attack our cities, even at that current moment. Thanks.
I'd just like to jump in as well and note that anecdotally, what we saw in the early days was that staff played a large role. And so the companies that chose to leave often did so because their staff voiced deep concern for the Ukrainian people and placed pressure internally on corporate decision makers. It's not something I think we'll only know the impact of that in retrospect, but it seems to be a critical part in the decision-making process.
皆さんありがとうございます。続きまして、次の質問に移りたいと思います。6時42分に匿名の参加者の方から英語でいただいている質問です。エネルギー分野の日本企業の中には、日本政府がエネルギーの安定供給を確保するために操業を継続するよう要請したため、ロシアでの操業を継続しなければならないと述べている企業がいます。政府の要求と企業の責任の間でジレンマに陥っているこれらの企業に対して、これらの企業は2つのジレンマをどのように対処するべきか、 意思決定のために参照できるガイダンスやドキュメントはありますかとのことですが、こちらに対して、お答えいただけますか。
I can answer probably partially, as I also provided some answers and can show some 2 more slides, just in quick, as quick reaction. That's strange for me that Japanese government is directly asking companies, yes, in the energy sector, probably that could be, but I am not sure that it's publicly. Because what we see is that bilateral relations between Japan and Russia, past time, they reached the greatest aggregation since the World War II. Since March last year, Japan taken a decisive course towards the restoration of sovereignty over Southern Kuril Islands. And after we saw that armed forces of Ukraine provided success to, let's say, second army of the world, Japanese foreign ministry presented Blue Book of Diplomacy, where for the first time, for the long period, disputed islands of Iturup, Punashir, Hanomai, and Shikotan were called as territorial belonging to Japan and temporarily occupied by Russia. The Kremlin has reacted with a series of diplomatic worries, and Japanese government is making mistake, I think, with ignoring the peaceful path of that development. From that moment and on, political relations between Tokyo and Moscow are practically suspended. And although before we can see that ex-prime minister met Putin about 27 times. And at the end of last year, we saw that Japan is making radical adjustments to 3 major security documents: the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, and Defense Construction Plan. In particular, in the coming years, it is planned to double Japan's defense spending to 2% of GDP, which is almost $320 billion a year. That's the 3rd place in the world after US and China. And also hypersonic missiles with a range of 1,000 kilometers will be deployed in the islands, those islands which are considered as occupied. And also missiles with longer radius will be deployed in other large islands. And also, like, from energy sector, that's, I understand that there is a good situation currently, that prices decreased, and we saw that Europe before also like increased their stocks, but also we see that there is a continuing trend in the military, let's say, formation of new sources. There is Australia, United Kingdom, USA, and Japan, in fact, unofficially integrated as well over the entire Pacific space. And of course, that's for Moscow, that's very dangerous situation. In fact, they will have the second front opened on the other side of the country. And for Ukraine, it will be also, I think, very, like, after 11 months of war, the right time for companies which still stay to make the right decision and to really leave the terrorist states, which was already like identified like that. Are there any other questions?
アンドリーさん、ありがとうございます。はい。続きまして、記事6分に、ていますこちらも匿名の参加者からいただいております。欧米や日本企業が撤退しても、中国企業やインド、東南アジア企業などにとって変わられるだけだという主張にはどう反応しますかという質問が来ています。こちらについてお答えいただけますか。
My first reaction is that those parts and technologies are more laggards in comparison to, for example, Japanese or US ones, and they will never be able to substitute with those components the weapons which they're using now. Also, probably worth to mention that the United States applied separate, let's say, sanctions on China, and they are not able now to produce high quality semiconductors without allowance of United States. That was in the news in some recent time before. You can easily find it. Probably colleagues can add something to that.
ナターリさん、何か付け加えることなどございますか？もう一度質問を読みますね。すでに撤退を決め、申し訳ございません。もう一度再度質問を読ませていただきます。欧米や日本企業が撤退しても、中国企業やインド、東南アジア企業などにとって変わられるだけだという主張にはどう反論しますか？という質問が来ております。ナターリさん、何か付け加えることなどございますか？リチャードさん、はい、どうぞよろしくお願いします。
This is a question that came up particularly early in the war. As American companies leave, Chinese companies will replace them. It's a turnkey operation. This is the obvious path that we're going to see. It hasn't turned out that way. We just haven't seen that happening. And so, until we see this as a trend that looks feasible, it seems it's a hypothetical question it seems a bit of a bogeyman at the moment. We're just not seeing that set of behaviors. So, and if I'd be interested, Andre. I can't think of many good examples. I suppose you could look at the McDonald's example where they were sold. They were sold to a Russian oligarch, and now there's a Russian McDonald's. But that doesn't seem to be where this question is headed. When it comes to major industries that would either support the war effort or be major drivers of the economy.
Yes, by the way, at the end of last year, as it was presented at one of the conference which was organized in tech sector, there was Sberbank and its head, and he said that unfortunately what Russia sees now, that with exiting of big international MNCs out of countries, that they're losing not only physical assets, but also access to technology, to competition. And for example, in case of McDonald's, we did some analysis before how such companies are integrated in economy, and the multiplier of 4 or 5 times should be used, because, for example, of course, McDonald's is, for example, they have a lot of intermediaries, yes, and a lot of other local companies, logistics companies, and so on. And let's say $1 earned by McDonald's allowed to earn another $5 in the economy. So that should be also considered. I also shared, just to returning to the question which was asked regarding those high sector, and there was article on that Biden and the US introduced a ban on China of exporting semiconductors. You can read it. It was at the end of the last year. There was a big scandal that a lot of let's say expats from US who worked in China they were like asked to leave the country just overnight. And after that, plants were blocked and technologies were not allowed to be used. And we understand that those kind of technical advance of those technology differs a lot in case of China own produced and if it's produced based on technologies used and which belong to US companies. And that was a very good step of US, I assume, and thanks to that.
If I might just come in briefly on the question that I'm not sure was fully answered. There was a question, how do we ensure that average Russian locals and Russian government are not significantly hurt when businesses exit the Russian market? Well, I think we need to be very, very clear. Russia is waging a genocidal war against Ukraine. Already over 65,000 war crimes have been committed. Very unfortunately, that majority of the Russian population is supporting the actions of the Russian government to pursue this war. And that number of loyalty has not decreased, but stayed stable and even increased all throughout the last 11 months of full-scale invasion, regardless of the fact that the Russian population is choosing to suffer and enlist in the army and in other ways. The suffering of the Ukrainian people is incalculable, it's immeasurable. So right now, there are a lot of processes to create the International Court of Justice that the like of Nuremberg trial that would prosecute not only the Russian government who started the war, but also all of the people around it, all of the businesses that have supported it, of Russian or non-Russian origin who would enable it, and also the propagandists, you know, the people involved in creating the precondition for the very unfortunate level of absolutely unjustified hatred that has led to this war and Russian neo-imperial ambitions in the European continent of the 21st century. So what we are trying to ensure is that the level of suffering of Ukrainians is radically decreased. And that can only happen if businesses not only comply with sanctions, not only if the level of sanctions increases itself, but also if businesses just simply choose to be on the right side of history. Ukrainian Alexandra Matvichuk, whose Center for Civil Liberties is documenting all of these war crimes related to tortured people, to raped people, to people who have been killed, to people who have been maimed by the war, to people who have been filtrated in various kinds of camps that Russia is creating right now for Ukrainians. She said, you know, you don't have to be Ukrainian to want to end this, you just have to be human. So I think this is also our appeal to all companies that have any word like human rights in their mission statement or in their vision of the world. They should be exiting Russia right now.
Thanks, Natalia. I fully agree with, and that's really good summary for our today's meeting.
皆様ありがとうございます。それではお時間となりましたので、ここで質疑の時間を終了いたします。参加者の皆様、非常に具体的な質問をたくさんお寄せいただき、誠にありがとうございました。そしてご登壇者の皆様もお答えいただきありがとうございました。では最後に、ヒューマンライツナウ小川隆太郎事務局長から閉会の挨拶をお願いしたいと思います。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。
はい、皆さん、こんばんは。事務局長4月からやっております、弁護士の小川隆太郎と申します。改めまして、本日、皆さんお忙しい中、大変多くの方にご参加いただきましてありがとうございました。また、B4Ukraineの皆さんもですね、お忙しい中ですね、オンラインで、時差もある中大変だったかとは思うんですけども、ご参加いただいてありがとうございました。あと、通訳の方も今日ちょっと早口で、喋ってしまったスピーカーもいた中で、本当に大変だったかと思いますが、ありがとう。で、今日のテーマですね、ウクライナ戦争に関して、日本企業 第一的には日本政府ですけど、日本企業としてもどういったことができるんだろうかということをすべきなのかということについては、やはりこの、だいぶ厳しいですね、今日、意見を表明して、今日、ご参加された企業の方々の中には、ちょっと驚いてしまった方もいらっしゃるかもしれませんが、やはり、今起きていること、この戦争というのは、最大の人権侵害ということができます。そういった最大の人権侵害が起きているという現実に対して、責任ある対応を行っているのかということが、企業に対して問われているということだと思います。この B4Ukraine というキャンペーンは、日本だけじゃなくてですね、世界中で行われていまして、やはりその世界の多数の市民がですね、そういう厳しい目を今、企業に向けているという現実があります。で、日本では、昨年9月にですね、ガイドラインというのを、経産省が作りまして、ヒューマンライツデューデリジェンスについて、あくまでボランタリーな基準ですけれども、出しました。しかし、その中にも、紛争との影響を受ける地域においては、評価された人権デューデリジェンスを実施すべきであるということは、書かれております。皆さんもご存知かと思うんですけれども、ではですね、この昨年9月のそのガイドラインを受けて、このロシアで事業展開をする企業が、きちんとその強化された人権デューデリジェンスをしたのかどうかということ。で、その結果がどうだったのかということについては、残念ながら多くの企業は情報開示を十分にはしていないということかと思います。ので、我々としてはですね、ガイドラインを実行化するという文脈においても、あるいはガイドラインでは不十分であって、やはり日本にも、人権デューデリジェンスを義務付けるですね、法律が必要なんじゃないかということを検討する材料としても、このロシアにおける事業を継続している日本企業、あるいは撤退した企業も含めてですけれども、コミュニケーションしてですね、現状、今の日本の、その人権デューデリジェンスのですね、実態をしっかり把握していきたいなと思っています。で、やはりこうして話した間も、実は、登壇されていたアンドリーさんの、家では、空襲警報が聞こえたということをさっきおっしゃってましたので、本当に今、この瞬間もですね、空爆含めて、攻撃が続いていて、多数の市民が、命が危険にさらされ、あるいは失われているという現実がありますので、やはり待ったなしの状況だというふうに思います。もちろん企業の方もそんなに急に対応できないという現実もあるかもしれませんが、ただやっぱり我々市民としては、一日も早くですね、しっかりとした、許可された人権デューデリジェンスを実行してですね、リスクを分析して対応しきれないということであれば、即時撤退を求めていきたいというふうに思っております。ので、今後ともヒューマンライツの活動についてですね、協力いただいて、この B4Ukraine のキャンペーンもですね、今日ご参加いただいた皆さんと一緒に進めていければと思いますので、よろしくお願いいたします。以上です。今日はありがとうございました。
小川さん、ありがとうございました。最後に皆さんに1点お願いがございます。運営の今後の参考として皆様からのお声をお聞かせいただきたく、オンラインアンケートにご協力いただけますと幸いです。画面に投影しております QR コード、もしくはチャット欄に今お送りいたしました URL よりご回答いただけますようよろしくお願いいたします。また、ヒューマンライツナウでは現在冬募金を受け付けております。皆様のご協力をお願いいたします。それでは以上をもちまして本日のセミナーを終了いたします。皆さん、本日はお忙しい中ご参加いただき誠にありがとうございました。失礼いたします。